My name is Jessica Studdert. I am the Deputy Chief Executive of New Local. This is our first public event under our new name, formerly New Local Government Network. So we're really pleased to be holding this event today. We published the report, This Isn't Working, Reimagining Employment Support for People Facing Complex Disadvantage, authored by Tom Pollard and Pauda Chua, a couple of weeks ago. So really pleased to have this opportunity to discuss the report and its findings and have a general discussion about different perspectives on how our employment support system is working for people facing complex disadvantage. And the background to the report, as Tom will explain in a bit, is very much how we can focus in on community and add a community power and local dimension to a system that, for a number of reasons, is quite top-down and isn't working for too many people. So we're really pleased to be having this event today. We've had over 150 people sign up. So the beauty of doing these things virtually is that you are all very welcome. And if we were in a room, we would have problems, but we're online. So really looking forward to a great discussion. I'd like to say thank you so much to our partners, Lloyds Bank Foundation, who made the research possible, and thanks to our panel of speakers who we're joined by today. So Tom Pollard is the author of the report. We're also joined by Lisa Connolly, who's Employment and Services Manager at Halifax Opportunities Trust. Lisa, give me a wave. And we're also joined by Carlia Franklin, who's Disability Rights Campaigner. And we are also joined by Councillor Kieran Williams, who is leader of Southwark Council. So just before we get into the discussion, a few Zoom etiquette points. I'm sure you're very used to using Zoom for your life these days, but just to say, please do mute yourselves if possible, just so that we're not distracted by any background noise. And do feel free to turn off your camera because we've got a spotlight view set up for our speakers. However, we want to make sure this is as interactive a discussion as possible. So please use the chat function. I know you've already been emailed to submit your questions in advance, but as the discussion's going and you feel drawn to say something or to contribute or to ask a question, please do so in the chat. We're all very used to multi-channel engagement these days. So please do that, and we'll be referring to the chat, and I'll be picking on questions from it. So please get going with that. If you've got any problems throughout the session, our producer is Francesca. She is the person using the name New Local. So please private message her or email her. She was emailing you ahead of the event if you have any problems whatsoever on the technical side. And finally, if you are, we encourage you to use Twitter. Please, can you use the hashtag This Isn't Working, one word, no apostrophe, for any of your tweets. And so we'll just all see the reaction and see the discussion as we go. So I think I've done all the housekeeping bits. The first thing I'd like to do is just hand over to Duncan Shrubsole, who is the Director of Policy Communications and Research at the Lloyds Bank Foundation, just to say a few words of welcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jess, and it's great to have so many people here. Just three very quick things to kick things off. From the Lloyds Bank Foundation's perspective, we're really pleased to support this research because we fund frontline charities across England and Wales whose passion and mission is to support people to overcome various forms of disadvantage. We seek to support them through funding, through helping them develop and capacity build, and seeking to influence on issues that affect them. And many of those charities are directly helping people into work or picking up the pieces from the systems that are failing to support them. I'm also really pleased on a personal that one of the charities featured in this report is Switchback, where I'm Chair of Trustees, and it's a great example of a charity helping people. So that's why we wanted to support it. I think it's really important as an agenda. Sometimes the intention is there from DWP and ministers to help people, but too often the delivery has been wrong and hasn't worked. Too top-down, too centralist, too one-size-fits-all. And as Tom sets out and Powder in this report, it needs to be more holistic, easy to engage and specialist. But what's great about this report is it brings together three agendas that are often separate: the agenda around how to help people, the agenda around how better to support charities, and the agenda around how to empower communities. And it brings those three together with a compelling analysis of what's wrong, but also what needs to change. And so lastly, it's really timely. Tom kicked this off before COVID was even heard of. And as often happens, that can delay things. But actually now to be launching this today, it's really timely because we've seen with unemployment rolls rising and universal credit claims rising that the need to focus on those who've always been poorly served and always been in need of back to work support is there. But we've also seen things breaking open. If ever there was a case for top-down centralist private contracts not working, then we can see it now, and then better need to empower local and charities. So we hope that this report and this launch will help galvanise people behind what it sets out and help to break those cracks open into a bigger wedge and to a case for change more broadly. So delighted to support and hope you all have a really engaging conversation and are fulfilled in the case for making the case for action to follow. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Duncan. I think that set up the discussion really nicely as well. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's the author of the report, who will be taking us through the key findings. Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks, Duncan, for all your support. And thanks to everyone for coming today. It's great to see so many people keen to engage in this discussion. Hopefully you should be able to see my slides on screen now. Is that working? Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm going to give a quick overview of headlines from the report that Powder and I wrote, published a couple of weeks ago. Now, the report's focused on a group we referred to as people facing complex disadvantage, which is slightly cumbersome, but for us, that's about a combination of unemployment, disability and long-term health conditions, and then other social disadvantages that often accompany this. So most obviously kind of poverty and debt, issues such as poor housing, and then sometimes more severe issues such as drug and alcohol misuse and contact with the criminal justice system. And it's about how these issues interact and compound each other, which is why we wanted to talk about this in broader terms than just talking about disability and health. But within the current system, this group is broadly represented by the 2.3 million people on disability-related unemployment benefits. And only about 4% of this group move into work each year, and actually the group is growing overall, so more people join than leave. And I don't feel there's really been any significant improvement in outcomes over the last 20 years. And it's not just that the system is ineffective in terms of achieving outcomes. For many people, it's actively damaging. So, you hear about the impact on people's mental health because of the stress and anxiety the system causes, but in turn, this decreases people's willingness to engage with support. And I've spent years working on these issues, including 18 months inside DWP on secondment, advising on mental health. And I don't believe these failings are just down to poor policy implementation or poor policy. I think it's also the result of deep-rooted systemic, cultural and institutional problems with the way this issue is approached. First of all, the way people are perceived and treated by the system as benefit claimants, it's just not conducive to the type of helping relationships that are needed to support people through major life changes. DWP is the biggest government department, and its worldview, I feel, is fundamentally constrained by its own practice and infrastructure and just the way it currently does things. And then fundamentally, it's a system that people tend to comply with rather than enthusiastically engage with. And repairing the lack of trust that exists in the system would take many years to achieve. So rather than focusing on just how we might improve the current system within the parameters DWP has defined, we wanted to think about what a system might look like if it started with the people who need the support and the places and communities they live in. So getting all the baggage of the benefit system and the current procedure and physical infrastructure, if we were starting from scratch, how would we build a system that best supported people facing complex disadvantage? This table here sets out some of the key areas of contrast between current DWP-led system and what a more community-led approach could look like. There's more detail of that table in the report itself. So with that framework in mind, we started to speak to local commissioners and providers of the sort Duncan referred to there, so many local specialist charities, about how they work at the moment. And we heard about many strengths that already align with the vision we wanted to set out in the report. So first of all, the type of trusting, personalised relationships that the evidence shows are absolutely critical to supporting people. That's the thing these providers focus on above all else. It's something they're well placed to do, and it's something they're effective at. Secondly, providers and commissioners we spoke to have an intimate understanding of the communities and areas they serve and the local ecosystems of support that can be harnessed to help address people's needs. Thirdly, because of their shared ethos and commitment, local services often work well together in partnership to support people across a range of needs. And then finally, commissioners and providers that we spoke to are well placed to engage with and even try to actively shape the local labour market to foster employment opportunities for this group. But we also heard about serious limitations on the ability of local and specialist providers and commissioners to deliver the type of support they'd like to. They're often constrained by contracts that don't give freedom, resources and long-term security to develop and grow. It's difficult for many local and specialist providers to get access to DWP funding in the first place because they often favour more generic national providers. There have been some moves in recent years to allow greater local control, but people we spoke to who have been involved in these devolution processes said that they were still having to design and deliver services very much within the parameters of the existing DWP model. And then the wider impact of underfunding of local authorities, the NHS, the third sector over many years undermines the ability of providers who are focusing on employment support to effectively support people facing complex disadvantage. Even though local services are keen to collaborate, the combination of kind of remote control of the system from Whitehall and the marketised approach to commissioning undermines this. And then finally, because DWP is so dominant in the system, and for many people, employment support has become kind of synonymous with benefits in the job centre. This undermines the ability of local providers and commissioners to convince people that what they're offering is something that's truly different. So based on these insights, we start to think about what would it take to overcome the problems with the current system and move us towards something like the vision for a more community-led approach that's set out in the report. And ultimately, for the scale of transformation we're talking about, it's going to take major changes in national policy. So we argue that DWP is simply ill-suited and badly placed to engage effectively with this group. Instead, should only be responsible for providing financial support. And this support needs to be paid at a level that provides genuine security. It should be more straightforward to access and retain. The resources DWP currently commits to employment support for this group, which is around £700 million. Sorry, I just collapsed something under the table, should be devolved to local areas to boost their existing efforts. And then these local areas should also share in the savings that DWP and Treasury experience if people are supported back to work. But there's details in the report about how we do that to avoid the kind of perverse incentives in the current system. And then the process of devolving these resources should actively encourage and support local areas to develop community-led approaches, help people facing complex disadvantage move towards employment. And then the wider national social and economic policy should foster an inclusive economy across the country and help to address some of the structural inequalities that contribute towards the disadvantages people experience. And then we've set out suggestions for how local areas should proceed. So ideally with the power and resources set out on the previous slide, even in the absence of those national policy changes, we think local areas can demonstrate the value of the type of approach we describe and build the case for change. That starts with developing strategies for what local support services should look like, working in collaboration with communities they serve through participatory, deliberative approaches, to understand the needs and strengths, aspirations and resources that already exist in the community. Critically embedding employment, including for those facing complex disadvantage, as a cross-cutting objective within these strategies, to ensure it's seen as something that all relevant services should be contributing towards, because we do think that good work with the right support is beneficial for people's health, particularly their mental health, and we should be ambitious about what people can do. This can only be achieved if people are bought in to the system. So services themselves need to be designed and delivered by or in collaboration with the community, with a particular focus on engaging and empowering people facing complex disadvantage. And then funding and evaluation for these services and the wider system to promote holistic, collaborative approaches that maximise community participation. So finally, here's what we hope the impact of the report will be. We wanted to provide inspiration to try and stretch the debate, to encourage collaboration across the types of organisations and individuals who are present today, help us move towards a fundamentally different approach. And there are going to be opportunities to shift this debate. As Duncan said, the wake of COVID, we're also due a new government disability strategy next year. But really, this depends on whether people like you think it's something that's worth rallying around and working towards. So on that note, I'll hand back to Jess and we can hear from our panellists and then take questions from you.
Thanks very much, Tom. I do encourage you all to read the full report. Tom's done brilliant justice to it with his presentation, but there's a lot there, and hopefully we can draw out some of the specifics in the discussion. So over to our panellists. I'd like to go to you first, Kalia, if that's okay. You have obviously got lived experience of the system. So really interested to hear from you, your perspectives in general, and how does this chime with your experience?
Hi, everyone. Thanks ever so much to Tom for inviting me to comment on his report, because having campaigned in the disability and welfare sector for a long time, there aren't that many people who really live by the changes that they're trying to make. And Tom is really one of those people who I have a lot of time and respect for. So it's brilliant to see this report. It wasn't necessarily surprising to me as a disabled person with a fluctuating condition who's had experience of welfare to work in various forms since about 2003. And in thinking about today, I was reflecting particularly on what had changed from those early years. So I remember being, a relatively young adult in my late 20s, starting to go to events that were set up to try and encourage disabled people into work. And in those days, they were very much about encouraging rather than forcing. And they were very benign compared to what came later. But they were also quite expensive, ineffective, and a bit useless, really. So I'd go to events and I'd always come away with loads of free light bulbs. They only just ran out in the last year or so. And there would be firemen there, which, was quite a big thing in my late 20s as turning up. Sometimes, if you were lucky, there were things like massages and free food, but there were never any jobs available. Just people working for organisations that made money by putting on these events. Now, over the years after 2010, that really changed very significantly. There weren't free light bulbs and lunches and things like that anymore. And the climate towards disabled people was one of coercion and sanctioning rather than encouragement or patronising as it had been before. I eventually moved into paid employment in about 2013, 2014. And I would say that was despite the DWP and despite work programs. It wasn't any of those things that enabled me to work. So in the pre-COVID days, if we can remember that, actually going back 7 years or so, there was this enormous battle from disabled people with energy limiting conditions that made it difficult to travel to and from work, to be able to work from home. And employers were very suspicious of it. So hopefully that has changed and changed for the good. But there were probably 4 key factors in what enabled me to move from being on employment support allowance into paid work. And one of those was that because I was in the support group, I wasn't subject to any sanctions or to coercion. And just because of my age and the stage at which I had moved into the benefit system, I'd been lucky enough to go through a more supportive time rather than one where I was constantly fighting for reinstatement of benefits or for enough to pay very basic bills. And I think that as long as people are subject to that, it's incredibly difficult to get anything else to work, because what you do is you spend your life fighting those imposed battles rather than being able to put the effort into developing your skills or volunteering. So that was absolutely crucial. And then the other 2 big changes for me, which work programs and DWP simply weren't able to offer any help with over the years were starting to receive social care and having the appropriate equipment in my life. So I spent years without a suitable mobility aid because I didn't quite qualify for a power wheelchair from the local authority because I walked at home. But without one, I couldn't get anywhere or do anything. And I also spent all my time and effort trying to maintain a basic safe environment, to feed myself, to be able to shop. And there just wasn't the time or the ability after all that to engage in work, let alone paid work. So the big thing that changed was receiving a social care package that enabled me to live a more full life. And within a couple of months of that, I was in paid employment from home and no longer on employment support allowance. The other key, of course, was the reasonable adjustments to be able to work from home, and having an employer who recognised that making those changes enabled you to get really skilled employees. But of course, those 4 points, apart from the sanctions and the coercion, they weren't things that any work programs could do anything about. I didn't particularly need help with my CV or learning how to dress for an interview. And that was really what was on offer. And what would happen when you were judged as having more complex disadvantages, which is a terrible term for any human to have, was a quiet, well, you don't need to worry about this. Off you go. It's fine. You don't have to engage with this unpleasant system. But what we do with that is sort of a stigmatizing protection that stops people from being able to move across into paid work and from being able to transform their lives. But as Tom says, this isn't something that the DWP can offer. In fact, they put active barriers in disabled people's way and hoops that have to be jumped through, which just push you further, really. So if we saw a proper system of joined up local support, like Tom is recommending, where the employment services could liaise with wheelchair services and say, okay, this person may not fit your exact criteria, but if we can find a way to get them the equipment they need, then they will find their way into work for themselves. So I would say I fully support Tom's recommendations about localism, about joined up thinking. And I think the one thing that I would emphasize is the ability of that employment support to help people to overcome those barriers in relation to social care and to equipment and to reasonable adjustments. And all those things, I think we would see some progress towards reducing that disability employment gap and those numbers, which haven't really shifted since 2003 when I first started doing this, and certainly not in the last 10 years.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's really interesting to hear your perspective, and I guess what you're saying as well is that it was different parts of the system. It wasn't the DWP that ultimately that kind of joined up thinking locally. That it's not just one service that has the answers. It's that kind of local ecosystem, which we always say things like that, but actually only those conversations and support can be kind of patched together locally, and ultimately by listening to the individual and their own situation and expectations and hopes. I just to ask you, Kalia, I mean, what did you find from the DWP? Did you find any support from the DWP, or did anything that was currently happening make the difference to you at all that you could kind of catch hold of?
No. I'd like to be more positive, but no. And like I say, I was really lucky because I wasn't being subjected to sanctions. And it wouldn't have mattered how many sanctions the DWP applied to me. I still couldn't solve those barriers to employment without the social care and the equipment and the reasonable adjustments. And I found, I still have social care and I still have equipment, but my employer changed and removed the reasonable adjustments. So actually, after all that effort, I'm back on employment support allowance again in the support group, but not entitled to any money because I wasn't earning enough. So for someone who spent the best part of 2 decades floating around those systems, it's an awful lot of damage to an awful lot of people when actually it's not necessarily benefiting the people on the receiving end of it at all.
Yeah, and I think the points you're making about stability and security in the rest of your life, giving you the energy to focus on employment searching and career is something that Tom's report really brings out. Thank you so much. Right, Lisa, I'd like to go over to you now. You're Employment Services Manager at Halifax Opportunities Trust. So I know you work with a range of people and kind of live and breathe some of this in your day-to-day practice. So really interesting to hear your perspective.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Fabulous. Okay, thank you for having me. When I saw the report, it was literally a sum up of the rants that I've been having for the past 10 years of delivering these projects. So I've worked a long time delivering DWP contracts and ESF contracts, and there's there's lots of problems as we hear and in the report, but one of the biggest ones I would like to see removed is the payment by results model. So for anybody that doesn't know, a lot of contracts that are managed by the DWP for employment support providers, they put a payment by results model on there, which means that you don't get any money until you've got somebody into work and then they've sustained the job for quite a while. Now, when you're putting together a programme, and that programme is designed to help people with complex needs, it defeats the object if you put that price tag on it, because naturally what's going to happen for people and employment advisors working with people is that they're going to be hammered to meet those targets. And then naturally what's going to happen is that the people that really need that support, they kind of get left over here again because of the way that the model has been set up. So for me, payment by results is just a no-go. That needs to go completely. The same with mandation to projects as well. You know, when you're mandating somebody to a project, you're holding them to ransom because there is a sanction involved in that. And we avoid them like the plague because we're a charity that is an anti-poverty charity. So for us, it's kind of like, well, we don't want to be, you know, delivering these projects that could potentially be putting people into more poverty, you know, again. So that group of people will also miss out on the support that's available in the community as well. So the PBR model is a real bugbear of mine that I really struggle with. In terms of other things, it's things like finding match funding for these projects. A lot of these projects are quite big. If it's the only funding available as a small organisation, you know, we haven't got millions of pounds sitting in the bank to put on the table for match. So therefore, you know, we have to put in an expression of interest to deliver that through the prime model. And again, why is it that we need to have primes involved? You know, why does it have to be a large nationwide organisation that needs to manage that and take a 30% management fee when, you know, we're quite experienced and we know our community and we know the people that we work with and what they need? You know, just completely cut that out. That's a huge step. I can't imagine that would happen anytime soon. But again, just my thoughts, you know, on what I would like to see in terms of the way these things are put forward. In terms of the way that we deliver, it's really difficult because actually, when I read these things in the report, I think, well, for me, it's not rocket science. You know, for me and my team, that's kind of, isn't that how it should be anyway? You know, people walk through the door, they're a human being, they're not a claimant. You know, we put the kettle on, we make a cup of tea, we let them make a cup of tea. You know, we don't expect them to throw the cup of tea over us. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you know, we're all people. We need to sit down and talk about how we can support you, you know, and it's about that person, not about meeting the needs of a pigeonhole of a contract. So for me, that's it's difficult to sort of talk about that because it's the day-to-day approach that we have anyway. That is the way that we treat people. I think that moving towards this vision is going to be quite difficult. Over the years when I've been going to DWP meetings, you know, with the projects that we've delivered, I always feedback. I'm always quite vocal with these things, probably quite impertinent at some of the meetings that I go to as well. I appreciate I'm just a charity worker, so you know that I'm not at that strategic level. However, I do try to feed back to the DWP during, you know, delivery that, you know, this doesn't work. You know, we have to find a very careful balance operationally when, you know, we're protecting people from these pigeonholes and from these labels. You know, economically inactive. You know, calling somebody that is insulting. You know, oh, you're inactive, so come on. You know, it just sounds horrible. So I always feedback that we shouldn't be doing things like that, but whether it actually gets anywhere. So I'm hoping that as a collective voice, if it's loud enough, that someone somewhere might actually listen and go, oh, maybe we should relook at this. And just as an example of that, when the Work and Health Programme was announced, we obviously looked at that and we put in expressions of interest based on the fact that we thought, oh my goodness, maybe they are looking to change this, because they said, oh, we want, you know, a third of the delivery of this to be with community-rooted organisations. And we thought, great, at last, maybe they're starting to look at this. And we did actually get to the opportunity to deliver the contract for Calderdale with the Prime that won the contract. But when we looked at it, actually, with the PBR model that they'd put on there, rather than relaxing it, it was absolutely just more intensified with that, but also the numbers, you know, the way that they wanted to do it. We just said, no, we can't. This will take us away completely from the ethos that we have as an organisation to deliver, you know, holistic support to human beings. So we turned it down, and that was a 7-year contract. And as an organisation, we said, no, we're not going to deliver this. It's not what we're about. So things do need to change. In terms of job centre locally, I think there are work coaches. I don't want to demonise the job centre too much, because I think there are work coaches on the ground, again, operationally, that do genuinely want to help people, but they're just restrained by the processes that have obviously come down from the top. For example, our local job centre, they do something called open house, where it is for people to come in and meet services like addiction services or mental health services. But again, even the infrastructure of their building doesn't allow for that, because they had everybody in one room, you know, sitting around a room looking at each other. Well, nobody's going to open up in that environment. You know, they don't have the ability to sit down with somebody and have that confidential conversation with them over a cup of tea. They can't do it. So even if that work coach on the ground wanted to, they just don't have the infrastructure to be able to deliver that service, which is where community anchors come in. Just as a sort of final point, really, is about employer engagement. Now, a lot of the larger organisations that deliver these contracts, they'll employ an employer engagement officer, and then they will go to, you know, they'll say to that employer engagement officer, right, you must get 60 vacancies a week. You know, that's your target. So that officer is going to go out to employers, get vacancies, bring them back that we can't fill, you know? So it's not doing anybody any good. The way that we look at employer engagement, I think what's really important is that we take the person when they're ready you know, so we might have done a lot of work with them in terms of their mental health, you know, what other barriers that they might have. And when they are ready and when they choose that they're ready to then start looking for work, our employer engagement officer will then meet with them, get to know them, and then approach an employer. They might not even have a vacancy. It'll be because we've got that relationship with that local employer to say, you know, we're working with this person, these are their strengths, these are their skills, this is what they're looking for. Can you offer an opportunity for them? And that is the way that we approach that as well. So it's just looking at it just slightly differently. It's not rocket science, but it's really important that those changes happen, really, if we're going to go forward with that. So yeah, that's my sort of take on it, really.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And it's really, really interesting to hear that. And I guess it feels to me like it sort of slightly echoes what Carly is saying, in that as a small charity, that kind of stability and security and not bureaucracy to enable you to kind of get on with what you do best is a really important feature of the system, that you obviously spend a lot of your time in this kind of bid process, or a lot of financial insecurity kind of comes from what you can or can't be part of, whilst maintaining that clear ethos that you clearly have so strongly as part of what you do. So really interesting contributions. I'm going to go over to Councillor Kieran Williams now, the leader of Southwark Council. Southwark are a council that have got an enormous priority around employment support for your residents. So I'm really interested to hear your perspective and how things chime from your part of the world.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to join the event. This is a really important and timely report, I think. So my thanks to Tom and Powder and everyone who's been involved in putting it together. As we go into this period with rising unemployment and a real worry for people in our communities, we know that it is those that face the most barriers that are most likely to lose out from this. And I really hope that this is a moment that the government listens and thinks about how you put in place support that genuinely helps people who are trying to find their way back into work to do so. Our approach in Southwark has been very much in line with what you're suggesting here. So we have a programme called Southwark Works that we set up in 2018 that is commissioned from small local organisations, locally rooted organisations to provide employment support. And they focus on providing support for different client groups. So we have organisations supporting young people who've been in touch with the criminal justice system. We have those supporting those who have disabilities. We have those supporting ex-offenders, people who've been long-term unemployed. And why have we taken that approach as a council and invested about £1.5 million a year in that? It's because the national systems we know don't work. And they don't work for a whole multitude that Kalia and Lisa have described so perfectly. I'm not sure I can add much more to that, other than getting into work is a collective endeavour. And people themselves have their role to play, and we all know that for the vast majority of people, good quality work, and it does have to be good quality work, is good for people, and most people want to do that. And that's the barrier for most, is not that they're shying away from this idea that work is something they want. It's what people want for themselves, but they want it in a way that works for them. But they need the support that goes with that, and that support is multifaceted. And doing it on a local level, as we've been doing in Southwark and others do, allows you to think about that coordination. And it's the role of, yes, employment support, but of social care, of healthcare, of children's services, of housing interventions, of other benefits, advice and support that sits outside of DWP. All of those things have a role to play. And it's when they come together that people are best supported. And that's something you can only make happen locally. And of course, on top of that, vitally importantly, is the role of the employers themselves. And working with employers, as Lisa has described, is about relationships. And it's about building relationships with those employers to understand the vacancies they'll have coming up in the future at the most basic level, but also to help them understand how they can adapt their practices to bring people in that they want to employ, who are facing barriers to employment by them at the moment. And whether that's making adaptations for people who've got disabilities, or working through the culture change in organisation to understand that just because a young person's been in touch with the criminal justice system doesn't mean you can't help them have a great life and succeed in work and be successful. all of that happens over time, and having big national or regional providers that come in intermittently every few years, then subcontract most of the work, just doesn't work as an effective system to that. Those big organisations can't build relationships with social care, with children's services, with schools, with employers. That has to be done on a relatively local level. And we can talk about what local means. Is that a city level or a council level? But it has to be done locally. And to make it effective, that knitting together is incredibly important. But I think most profoundly in all of this, the challenge back to DWP and to the government is to try and step away from this culture that we have in Britain of employment support being something that is just about trying to drive down the benefits bill. And we all understand that that's always going to be a challenge for the government. I have incredibly tight budgets to manage as a council leader. I know that I can't deliver services that don't also help keep the costs reasonable and successful. We all know that's the case. But as a society, people want to work. People want to work. Communities want people in their community to work. Local authorities want people to be able to get into employment. The outcomes are shared, and we need to move to a system where there's trust and commitment to work together and focus on that, the outcomes. How many people are supported to get into long-term sustained employment? And we think a model as you've described can be very effective. We're finding that we're getting about 40% of people into sustained employment by providing locally rooted support, delivered mostly by charities that are Southwark or London based, have a long-term commitment to their community, long-term connections with all of those bits of public service I've mentioned, employers, and most importantly, local people in our borough. So I really welcome the report, and I hope people listen to the changes that we need to make.
Thanks very much, Kieran. And I mean, your perspective and everything you're doing in Southwark kind of shows that this is a priority for so many local authorities, and so many local authorities are really doing a lot of this or trying to, again, against the system. And so, you know, probably therefore adding up to less than the sum of its parts. So I think a big part of this is how that energy all gets focused in the right direction. I would like to just go back to Tom, if that's okay, because you've obviously had the three panellists feeding back reflections. Just wanted to give you an opportunity to come back on that before I go over to the chat, and I can see there's lively discussion already flowing there. So we'll go to that to ask a few questions. But Tom, just want to give you the opportunity to respond to the responses.
Sure. I mean, first of all, just say thank you to Lisa and Kieran and Kalia for speaking, and it's great to have that kind of multi-level perspective. So someone who's been through the system firsthand, someone who's delivering frontline support, and then someone who's involved in kind of strategy and coordination of that support. And it's great to hear that aligns at all those levels with what we're talking about in the report. And I think you're right that a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily kind of rocket science. As Lisa says, it is about focusing time and effort on building those personal relationships with individuals you're supporting, with other services, with employers. But this is about how do we then create the environment that's best able to kind of foster and encourage that. And at the moment, as people have alluded to, the current system kind of acts against a lot of the stuff and undermines a lot of it. So really it's about, I think, being bold and confident, because often, as Kalia was saying, like, there's a sense of kind of protecting people from the system. And actually, I think it's our job to say, this isn't about us just saying, stop being mean, DWP. It's about saying, we agree in broad terms with the overall aim, which is supporting more people into work. But actually, we can do it better, and we can do it without causing this level of distress to people. And I think there's something about having the confidence of our convictions to argue for that, rather than just being stuck in a defensive position of saying, well, can you sanction people a bit less or be a bit kinder in assessments? So I think there's an opportunity for us to set the agenda here and sort of take back that territory.
Thanks very much. So just looking at the chat, there's lots of questions, which is great. I just want to sort of summarise a few, and I'll go back to each of the panellists, if that's okay, in turn for your views. There's a lot of agreement in principle with the findings of the report. I guess a couple of questions have revolved around the challenges with the DWP on this. How are we engaging DWP? How can they be engaged on this? How likely are they to devolve some of this power and responsibility to local areas? And the converse of that is, how do we ensure local areas have the capacity and capability to do this? And I guess there's always a fear of a risk of variability in approach. So that's one question about the kind of how do we do this? And how can it be a kind of practical, pragmatic endeavour? And then there seems to be another sort of set of questions around the interplay with health, and how do people who work at the front end of this, including DWP job support, how do we understand their training and qualifications around health and mental health, and how that would play a role, and linked to that around co-production and collaboration and peer-led models. I think this is an element that the report touches on. I'd just like to ask people how they think that would work in practice with people who have had lived experience of the system, potentially have come out the other side and been very successful from the system. How would that look like in practice if they themselves were to have more responsibility and control over designing support in a very different way? And I think we've had another couple of comments that have seemed to raise the issue of the wider system, and how that reinforces or doesn't reinforce the experience of people from the system, particularly access to what benefits and access to what disability rights around employment, and how that wider edge of the system can be better aligned to support people. Okay, so hopefully that's a good summary of some of the questions that have been coming through. Just like to go again to the respondents in the order I went to you in the first instance. I will come back to Tom at the end for final comments. But Kalia, can I go to you?
I think that the fundamental problem with changing these services is that we still have a political attitude where it suits whoever's in government, because they keep changing, but it suits them to have a group of people who are perceived as costing other people money to place blame upon. And until we can change that in some way, then all the other things are much harder to deal with. So although prior to 2010, there wasn't a lot on offer and it was all a bit patronising often, what there was a recognition that people sought out work and that people wanted employment if they felt that they were able to manage that with their lives. So I think co-production of services would make some real difference, especially if we're having those with lived experience around the table with the local authority budget holders, because in a lot of cases, the barriers are to do with inability to access other local authority services. Now, that's a real challenge for local authorities because they're not swimming in money to award care packages that perhaps fall slightly out of the current eligibility criteria, or equipment where someone can't move forward without it but doesn't meet the correct criteria. But until you change that kind of fundamental attitude of punishing people for being poor, for being unemployed, and you get back to providing a stability of adequate income and adequate security that can't be pulled away from people on the whim of an algorithmic assessment or someone having a really bad day at work in a job centre, you're not going to be able to get people to engage in the same way. I think there could be a lot more pressure from this sector towards government about how to do that. At the moment, we're looking at this wave of new volunteers, people who have previously been middle income, middle class, and who are now experiencing the welfare state for the first time and are very shocked and dismayed about how poorly they are treated and how little money there is. Whereas if you look back 20 years, we had about the same number of disabled people not moving as we do now. But what we had was this huge volunteering force in the third sector, which came from people who had stable benefits. So one of the outcomes that we could change is this doesn't have to all be about paid employment. It's about contribution, about reciprocity. So what we're losing is disabled people with stable benefits who spend 30 years in the voluntary sector as trustees or volunteers, and very happily so. That should be recognised as an outcome that work support can move people towards, rather than it all having to be paid jobs at a time when unemployment is rising, and we know that people with complex disadvantages are always pushed to the back of the queue, especially when you have very high pools of potential employees. So I think it has to be the things that Tom was touching on about engaging with government, engaging with local authorities in a different way to look at a slightly different focus of outcomes. It doesn't have to all be about paid employment, and it can't be punitive.
Thanks very much. I think it's interesting what you say about the COVID times we're in. There's both a kind of a challenge and an opportunity for this group. There's the challenge not to be overlooked when there is such a wider employment challenge. But absolutely, as you say, I think a lot of people are experiencing the system for the first time and are pretty shocked. So hope this is part of bringing it into the kind of public consciousness a bit more. Lisa, can I just go to you for any final comments as well?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of how do we do it, that's quite a big question on this front, isn't it? But what I would like to put forward is that it can be done, and it can be done with large contracts. We're currently delivering a contract called Building Better Opportunities. I'm sure some people have heard of it. It is joint funded by National Lottery and European Social Fund, and it's entirely voluntary for people. It's a very holistic package. We work with specialist partners to deliver mental health services, interventions for people. The outcomes are based on the outcome that that person would like. So, for example, if that is a health and wellbeing outcome, then that is an outcome. So it really allows us to be quite innovative and creative in our approach, but also be able to give people the interventions that they need and that they have asked for without trying to tick a box and fill a pigeonhole. So it can be done, actually, because that contract, the managing authority for that is the DWP. So, but it is quite a large contract. And going forward, when that contract finishes, we would like to continue with that model. You know, that for me is the best practice model. But however, the funds, again, you know, sorry to be so crass to talk about money, but, you know, it is a driver. You know, we have got staff to pay. We want those staff to stay in place to continue to support people. What I'm concerned about with that is that then, you know, a larger provider who has got some match funding then comes along and goes, oh, that's a really nice model. Oh, yeah, we like that. We'll take that. We'll put the match funding down. And then this huge provider then, you know, parachutes into our area and starts delivering a project that we've developed and that we've created. And that would absolutely stick in my gut. So, you know, we need to look at how we can recognise that organisations like ourselves do this and do this very well. And we are very capable of being able to hold those large contracts, you know, and be able to deliver them compliantly and very well for people. And more importantly, that it does actually help the people that we're talking about. That's the most important part of this. In terms of qualifications in the DWP, you know, for work coaches, for example, I think you mentioned mental health and specialist support. We would never pretend that we are specialists in every area, which is why we work alongside specialist partners in our community. They're local charities that are very good at what they do. and we fund them. We use our funding to pay them for the services so that we can offer a holistic approach to that person. So it builds their capacity as a charity. So, you know, we're not just asking them to do it for free, and it's a true partnership approach. So I don't think we should be asking work coaches to be delivering specialist support. I think, as Tom said in his report, I think we need to look at them being the transactional people, and then give us the opportunity to deliver what we deliver well alongside specialist partners and provide those interventions.
Brilliant.
Shut up now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Kieran, I just want to give you final comment as well. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry, Kieran.
For me, we've worked really well locally with the local job centre, and you know, we can always talk about things that could be improved, but that partnership works well. What I really hope we can shift is the national relationship between national commissioning of these services and what happens in local areas. And what we've seen over the last few years is a number of projects where it's been talk about devolution, but when it's come to it, it's been very rigidly specified contracts with strict project management that has really taken away from the ability to move beyond a model that's not been working, which all the evidence tells us not been working, to explore what the models that can work, and for local areas to be able to do that. And speak to some of those other questions. If you want to do that in partnership with health services, well, you have to do it at a level where health services can engage, and that means doing it on a local authority or a city area or a county area. You have to work at those levels. And I think the report just sets out really powerfully why that's the right way to approach things. And that we have to start from this perspective. As Kaylee was saying, you know, people are not trying to shy away from work. People want to do things in their lives, and whether that be working or other meaningful, important engagement in their community, that's what people want to be doing. And providing support that starts with that basis and wraps around in it the different elements that people need is the thing that will be effective in helping people achieve what they want to in their lives.
Great, thank you. It's pretty clear that how the funding works is the kind of root of a lot of this, and it kind of enables the system or blocks the system in so many different ways. So that's really, really helpful contribution. Okay, Tom, I just want to go back to you to give you the final say and to pick up any final outstanding points.
Well, just thanks again for everyone for attending and for other panellists. I think Callie needs to drop out in a second, but that's her cat hassling her as well. But it's been a really interesting discussion, and really nice to hear that what we set out in the report kind of has landed with people, and obviously lots of interesting questions coming up in the chat that we'll take away and think about more. I think lots of those are addressed in the kind of finer detail of the report, so I would encourage people to take a look. I know it's a bit daunting at kind of 98 pages long, but you know, you've got plenty of time during lockdown to mull it over. I just wanted to say quickly about thinking about kind of how we take it forward and how we influence, because you know, obviously I'm not DWP's most popular person, and I think this is really about sector-wide, well, beyond the sector, I mean, both, you know, local authorities, people working in charities, individuals, people who use the system. It's about everyone having what we hope now is a kind of clearer idea of what an alternative system could look like, rather than just arguing and haggling over the finer details of the benefit system, and then being able to argue boldly and confidently for that. You know, there are going to be opportunities coming up to set that agenda and change that debate. It's about doing it locally. It's about being confident that it could be done better locally with these kind of changes to infrastructure and policy, and then being bold and ambitious and united in saying we can do this better, both in terms of outcomes, but also critically in terms of people's experience of their services. And that, you know, this is about having a fundamental rethink, not just about tweaking the current system, because we've been trying that for the last 20 years and we haven't really got anywhere. So yeah, just thanks to everyone for coming, and do keep in touch with us and let us know your thoughts and anything we can do to help.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks to you for writing the report, and obviously with your co-author Powder. Thanks to our speakers Kalia, Lisa and Kieran. Thank you so much to Duncan and everyone at Lloyds Bank Foundation for supporting the report. Draw your attention to Duncan's great comment right at the end, which is a good one to leave it on. I think that it's very clear from the response to the report online, to you guys all attending today, there is from all parts of the system, local authorities, from providers, people who use the system in different ways, there is a kind of shared experience, and there is a shared consensus of some of the areas that need to shift. And I think that hopefully this report plays a part in articulating that. It's very much not the end. It's very much part of the process, and we will be continuing to be making our recommendations clear and to have discussions with DWP as much as we can. But anyone who's interested, please keep in touch. Please help us. Please be part of registering that case, because it's very clear that we do need to be articulating a broad consensus on this, and really be articulating collectively where the pressure points are and where the points of failure in the current system are, and what we can do differently. If you'd like to follow up on anything, just draw your attention to our website. Obviously, you can download the full report there. We've also got a podcast with Lisa, which is brilliant, and so you can find out a bit more about what is going on in the Halifax Opportunities Trust, and the recording of this will be available on our website. So please do share it with anyone you know who didn't get the opportunity to be here. But can I just say once again, thank you all so much for participating, and have a good rest of the day. Take care. Bye.